I think the path to progress lies in not just following a few points. It is not about just macroeconomic strategy. It is about the country as a whole, and how can we learn from, I would say, the successful stories. And successful stories are not in IMF or the World Bank or anywhere else. They are closer to home. They're in Asia, they're in China, they're in Korea, they're in Singapore, and there's a lot we can learn from them. And it will save us a lot of, reinventing the wheel, provided there is a, political will to do that. Pakistan's spending on education, just give you to the context, last year, it declined to a very long time low of 0.8% of the GDP. One of the lowest points before was Ziaul Haq's time, when it declined to less than 1% of the GDP. In Pakistan last year, it was about 1.5% of the GDP. The year before, it was 1.7. So we see a gradual decline in spending on education in relative terms. That is a very worrying development, and key reasons are two. One is, of course, our economic problems, but more than that, I think there is a lack of realization at the policy level, governments included, that education is as important as, for example, building the foreign exchange reserve. My personal experience is that a lot of these people just don't understand, or they don't have an immediate monetary incentive to spend on education in real terms. So it is, a bit of both. It is also the economic condition, but it's also the lack of will, and I would say, lack of interest in promoting education and spending on it in real terms. And that is probably one of the biggest negative developments and one of the biggest drags on economic growth. I would like to just expand on why it is crucial, why it is very important. We are living in I would call the age of knowledge capital, or the age of digital literacy. It is impossible to compete internationally until our people are well educated. They have the functional skills. They work in industry. To read even some of the basic manuals, industrial workers need to have some basic level of literacy. In Pakistan, to give you the whole context, barely 50% of the population, has functional literacy. And not just the literacy, the quality of education, there is overwhelming evidence it has gone down. So we are suffering on both counts, low literacy level and very low quality of education. I'm talking about not just a few schools in Karachi or big urban centers. I'm talking about Pakistan as a country as a whole. Without this, it is very difficult to, foresee how can we develop. Now we have a problem in terms of the way it is being structured. After the 18th Amendment, the powers were devolved to the provinces, and it became a provincial subject. So in terms of powers and the financial resources, it is the provinces who have the primary responsibility, but they have not delivered. For example, since 2008, the literacy rate in Sindh has not budged. The same thing applies to Balochistan and the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. In Punjab, some progress has been made, but mostly in the big cities. If you look at, for example, the South Punjab, things have not improved much, and certainly not in terms of the overall literacy levels. So where do we go from here? We need to understand that we have to take measures which go beyond our constraints, i.e., some people say you cannot touch this because it's a provincial subject. But look, what do we do now if the provinces have not delivered in 15, 16 years? Despite massive increases in budgeting, we have a tendency to reinvent the wheel. If you look around successful countries, be it a huge country like China or a mid-sized country like Britain, or a very small country like Singapore, the education is basically the responsibility has been devolved to local government level. It is the local governments in municipalities and at counties that are responsible for education, for primary school and high school education, and they have the budgets, and they also raise money through their own resources. So we have to, instead of reinventing the wheel, we have to follow what has worked in most other countries. And some people say that, well, let's privatize education. I would like to point out that even in countries like the United States or UK, which follow free market economics, overwhelming majority of the students, more than 80%, go to state-run schools, because for big populations, it is just impossible to educate the populations in a private school setup. They are expensive, and in a country like Pakistan, it costs a lot to run schools in rural areas, because our 60% of the population is still they live in the rural areas. So we have to think about the country as a whole, and for that reason, I would say that the spending powers, administrative powers, should be devolved to the divisions. And at division, it's not the district administration alone. They should run the education boards. They should have the representatives of the parents, of teachers. They should account for the budget through publication of their annual results. They should be independently audited. There should be accountability, so that we can say what are we gaining by spending so much resources. But that there is no system in place. Actually, the system is broken, and that's why, despite increases in the education budgets in a nominal sense, we have not seen any material results. Just to put things in context, Pakistan's current literacy rate is about the same, actually slightly less, than it was in Britain in the mid-19th century, that is around 1850. And that is a shame. We talk about all of these things about colonial legacy. Well, I'm sorry. Asian countries also, were colonized, but they have moved ahead. We still complain about it. And yet, for all that complaining, our literacy rate is where Britain was about 150 years ago. China was, around this level in the 70s, but they are now more than, close to 100%. So was South Korea in the 50s and 60s, but then they invested a lot of it in education. So if you look at all these countries, although Britain is a democracy, China is not. When South Korea invested in so much in education, it was not a democracy. So despite having different political systems, one common element, feature, which played a crucial and a very decisive role in their development was their focus on education, together with the investment in infrastructure. But we somehow think that just building big roads is investing in infrastructure. Our greatest resource is our people. We have to invest in them. And the best way to invest in them is through educating them. Somehow, all the debates, we have forgotten a very basic lesson from history. And we cannot really defy the history. And that is you ask for the learning, that is the lesson of history, be it in Europe, from France. Today even, our literacy rate is lower than it was at the time of the French Revolution in Paris, in the late 18th century, 1789. So how do we propose to progress if our education levels remain abysmally below the level they were 150 years back in Europe? My answer is no, we cannot. And therefore, we need to understand that there is no other alternative. We cannot, there is a lot of debate about, current account deficit, inflation, and all that. But I think that is a result that A lot of these so-called technocrats don't read history and fail to draw lessons from that history. In the last 34 years or so, the very objective way to look at the progress of a country is look at the growth in GDP per capita, per person GDP in real terms, excluding the effect of inflation. Because as we know, if there is a lot of inflation, then the numbers are meaningless. So if we look at the real growth rate in terms of GDP per capita, last 34 years, that is since 1990 or so, China was about 8.1%. East Asia, which is all of the East Asian countries, excluding rich countries like Japan, they grew at the annual rate of 6.8%. India grew at 4.5%. Pakistan's growth rate was 1.6%. That's a slightly less actually than our population growth rate, to just give you a context. Now, how can we break the cycle? That should be the number one question. I watched the interview of Dr. Atif Mia, and he said that we need macro financial stability, and for that we need to run current account surpluses, basically savings on remittances that will stabilize the exchange rate, but we should not tinker with the exchange rate. We should not manipulate it. I agree that we should not manipulate the exchange rate. But the very idea that Pakistan can run current account surpluses just because we can manage the remittances, I think, to be very honest, and I don't want to sound disrespectful, that shows Dr. Atif Mia's lack of experience. Not just in terms of policy, but also in terms of experience of the emerging markets. As you know very well, I think, I managed the emerging market economies, over 30 countries for a long period of time. The region that Mr. Atif Mia is talking about is East Asia. They were able to run current account surpluses, but current account surplus was a consequence of the policy. And what was the policy? The policy was export-led growth, but it did not come in a vacuum. I agree that we should follow an East Asia's playbook, but that's a very long term. You cannot just run current account surpluses, because especially for a country like Pakistan, which is very dependent on imported energy, that is oil and gas, it's virtually impossible for us to do that, to run a current account surplus on a consistent basis. Yes, currently we have a surplus, but before that, just 1 year, 2011, we had a very small current account surplus. So what should we do then? I think the answer is that if we look at the East Asia, there were two very, very important elements in the beginning of their, hugely successful growth cycle or growth strategies. One was the reforms in the agriculture sector, the land reforms. They introduced land reforms back in the 50s and the 60s. And then came another stage, which was the 70s, in which they invested heavily in education and infrastructure. And along with that, they followed a policy of very rapid industrialization. So what are the three elements? Investment in people, i.e. education, in infrastructure, then of course the land reforms, the agriculture reforms, and third was the industrial policy, the industrialization, which led to a massive growth in their exports, and hence what the results I just showed you, we saw that in the last 25 or 30 years. But that was the consequence of these policies. There is no short-term fix. So we can, instead of reinventing the wheel, and by the way, China, South Korea, Singapore, they did not get anybody from the IMF or the World Bank to advise them. They were the results of the homegrown policies of their own leaders who understood the local environment, who understood the local conditions, and who knew well what would work for their people. They did not get anybody, and I challenge you to explore this. They did not get anybody from IMF or the World Bank, or for that matter from Harvard, to advise them. Deng Xiaoping, Lee Kuan Yew, President Park of South Korea, and all these people, they were very, very wise people, and they were also very educated people. But they adopted policies which suited the conditions of their own countries, their own societies, and that's why they were successful. Now it is up to us. Do we want to keep reinventing the wheel? Do we want to keep following the policies of the IMF, which have failed miserably in many countries, including Argentina, in Egypt, in Turkey? Or we want to follow the success stories of East Asia, China, South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, and so on? So the choice is before us. And I think if we focus on that, Pakistan can find a way forward.